The 540 is brought to you by StarCityGames.com's weekly sale. Head over to StarCityGames.com/sale and foil the plans of your foes with our foil sale. Do you get it? Because foil is a colloquialism for premium versions of cards and also a verb. You get it. From now until Sunday, December 19th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, you can save 15% on all Magic the Gathering foils, such as Foil Boil, Foil Brain Spoil, Foil Into the Royal, and so many more. This does exclude pre-order items, but for all of your other foil needs, head to StarCityGames.com/sale.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more. Before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
The 540 is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel and Design. Head over to coalesceapparel.shop and use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10% off your entire order. If you want to rep the coolest Magic the Gathering themed hoodies and t-shirts or stickers, head over to coalesceapparel.shop. Maybe you want to rep our fallen friend Golos with the Tireless Pilgrim versus the Multiverse shirt, or maybe you're Wooburg Forever and you want to go with the South Beach collection. Any way you want to do it. Anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club, we got you. MTG Jam, of course. And all of the Keeping It 100 line, there for you, coalesceapparel.shop. Use gift code SCG at checkout for 10% off your entire order. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the 540, your favorite Cube podcast, hosted on StarCityGames.com. I'm Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. And once again, I'll be joined by Ryan Saxe. Ryan, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm Ryan Saxe. You can find me on maybe when I said it was a long day, but that wasn't going to drag me down, that it was going to, give me a lot of energy. Maybe my brain's a little fumbled, I guess, for context for everybody listening, or maybe the editors will edit this out. I've basically been working for the last 12 hours, but I said to Ryan, not myself, Ryan, the other Ryan on the podcast, that the way that I work is usually that means I have a ton of energy after, but I don't know my own Twitter handle right now. I think it's okay. It's RC Saxe. You can find me at RC Saxe on Twitter.
You stuck the landing. Yeah, that was. I appreciate the way you really just leaned in and kept going.
Sometimes you need to do things for other people's entertainment, and usually that's you're about to slip and fall, and you might as well throw a banana peel. You have one in your pocket, just toss it.
Love it. Yeah, we don't do two takes here on the 540. And yeah, I have said more than once, the editors can edit this out on the podcast and it just ends up being aired. So get ready for that. But anyway, today we are going to be focusing on a topic. Of course, it is cube related. And this is something that you pitched, Ryan, and I like the idea kind of immediately on hearing it. We are talking about archetype diversity and redundancy. So why don't you tell me a little bit what you had in mind and what we're going to be discussing today?
Yeah. So basically, from my eyes, when designing any cube, right, there's you want to cater to an experience, a positive experience to the people that will be drafting your cube. That often means, there are different strategies that you support and there are different strategies that you don't support. not in the cubes of the highest power level, but in, let's say, pauper cubes or even, set specific cubes. Like Retail Limited, it's very common for people to start with the gold cards when designing cubes based on archetypes they want to support, right? And basically, when I think about this, there's sort of a dial. It's not exactly like a linear dial, but the more archetypes you support, the more diverse archetypes there are, generally speaking, the less redundancy there is across those archetypes because you only have so many slots in your cube. And on the other side of it, if you want your archetypes to be very redundant, maybe even let multiple drafters at the table draft them, then there's less room to include as many archetypes. So there's this natural balance that any cube designer needs to partake in, which is around archetypal diversity and redundancy. And, it's not just that it's a linear scale where, the more redundancy you have, it means you have to have less archetypes. And the more diversity you have for your archetypes, the, less redundant those can be. There's nice balance to find between these two things, particularly in, the way that you choose to design and include cards that can really bolster the cube by sort of both maximizing diversity, if you can, to give your the people drafting your cube a wide breadth of strategies to go for, but also at the same time trying to really keep redundant pieces in there to, I guess, what would be the best way to put this? To accompany that breadth with depth.
For sure. Yeah, so we're kind of talking about approaching your cube, how many different styles, strategies of decks can I draft, the diversity in what my archetype I'm drafting is. And then redundancy is kind of how much support is there for a given archetype. I'm in on this deck. How much of the cube is actually compelling to me as I'm drafting it, and how much of the important pieces of my deck, how many copies of any one thing that I care about are going to be around. And these two things, kind of like you were saying, they kind of sound like they're at odds, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that a lot of cube designers or people have the thought when they go to approach playing a cube, archetype diversity is nice because in theory that means greater replayability because you can do more different things. But then the redundancy is also very important for replayability too. I would argue it's at least as important as diversity because you actually need to see these decks come together in coherent ways. So I really like this topic when you brought it up.
Yep, and I'm excited to talk about it. There's almost, this is the kind of topic, and of course we're bounded by time. But I feel like with respect to just cube, I could sit down and speak to my wall about this for like at least 6 hours straight. It's really, it's almost, I would say that when I'm designing a new cube, or even when I'm thinking about additions or modifications to any cube that I have, this is the concept at the heart of how I'm making those decisions.
All right. Yeah. So I think this is going to be a really engaging episode. This is going to be a little bit more on the design side of things. There's kind of that dynamic. We're a cube podcast. We talk about as a player, we talk about as a designer. As always, like to make the note that understanding what goes into design really will, if you can translate it, be useful to you as a player, though the focus today is going to be a little bit more on the design side of things. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about archetype diversity, archetype redundancy. Those two things are each going to get their individual segment where we'll really go in depth. What does this mean? What does this look like? What are various ways to employ this specific concept in cube design? And then we're going to wrap things up by talking about the two concepts as they relate to each other and how to find a good balance for a given cube. Does that sound good, Ryan?
Perfect to me.
All right, so we're all set here. We're going to take our first break and we'll be back to talk about archetype diversity.
Look, we're all Magic players here, so I know you're probably like me. And you have some extra cards that are hanging around that you would love to sell for cash or maybe trade in for some more cards. Well, if you're looking to sell or trade your Magic the Gathering cards, it has literally never been easier. Visit StarCityGames.com/sell with a 30% store credit trade-in bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry. There is no reason to sell to anybody else. We have 4 convenient ways to sell your cards to us. 1, check out our buy list. You can find out exactly what we're paying for each of your cards individually right now. That too much work? Number 2, check out our ship and sell program. Put your cards in a box, tape it up, send it to us. We'll do the rest of the work. Or if you're passing through Roanoke, Virginia, come visit Star City Comics and Games, and we can sit down with a buyer and work out a trade right there in the store. Or if you might be a store and you're looking to offload bulk and you have over 500,000 cards you're looking to sell, we can come to you. Any of the ways that you want to work with us, go to starcitygames.com/sell. That's SELL right now for more information.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to our episode on Archetype Diversity and Redundancy. It's time to talk about Archetype Diversity, really get into the weeds. What exactly does this mean? So Archetype Diversity, there's kind of a wide range of things we can mean regarding this, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. I think at the beginning of this podcast, like I was saying, different words, particularly in the Magic universe, used by different people can mean vastly different things.
Right.
And so there's this whole large, set of things we could mean here. I think somebody saying, a diverse archetypes could just mean, one archetype per color pair, but they're all viable, right? It's a diverse set of archetypes versus, somebody else could mean, not having diverse archetypes is you just across all colors, across all color combinations, you support only what we'll call the macro archetypes, aggressive decks, combo decks, control decks, mid-range decks, those kind of just macro that'll bleed across all colors with no explicit definition. So there's almost only 4 flavors of decks in that space. But really, when I say diversity, I'm using it mostly to talk about the maximum of that, if I will, right? Like pushing the limit of how many things, or I guess I shouldn't say things in this case, how many archetypes, how many styles of decks or unique representations of strategies can a cube support. And when I say support, I want it to be implied that they are draftable and can 3-0 a pot, right? You could throw together a 360 cube with, a billion archetypes, but I wouldn't call it, to me, I don't want to call that diverse in the sense that the cube may just be completely undraftable. You'll never end up with a deck once when you draft it, right? Mm-hmm. So when I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about pushing sort of the bounds of how many different things that you can do in a cube that are also good.
Sure. So it's not just, I put this card in my cube, that means you can do this thing. An example of this, Wildfire and Burning of Xingyi pretty recently were cut from the Magic Online Vintage Cube. And if you weren't specifically looking at the list for a reason to get outraged, you wouldn't really know one way or the other that those cards were in the cube because it just wasn't a good thing to do. Like, technically, a red Wildfire deck is different from other flavors of red. So it's kind of this controlling combo adjacent kind of archetype. Yes, having Wildfire in your deck is different than not, but it's more a card that detracts from other archetypes because they can't play it than it is on power level to make some other archetype work. You really need to have your archetype driving cards be on the level of the rest of the cube.
Yeah, and you can, conjure a cube in which Wildfire is a great, sort of sub strategy of red mid-range decks, and it can be a really cool addition to your cube. But if it really just doesn't tango with what other people are presenting, as you put it, you're taking slots away from you're taking slots away from the other red decks, and you're doing so by giving it to something that is very unlikely to perform well. I used to love Wildfire as a way of promoting an odd red mid-range kind of deck. Or I guess maybe more so control. I'm not even sure what you would call a wildfire deck. But that's what's exciting about it, really. It's this perturbation on what red gets to do. And I think that's fun, and I think that's awesome. But I also cut it from my cube. I had it in my cube for a while, and it did perform well for a while. But in recent years, the threats have gotten so cheap. And many of them dodging wildfire, particularly relating to cheap planeswalkers. You could think that would bolster wildfire because you could draft those cards. But when everybody starts having them, then your wildfire is no longer the GG it used to be.
Mm-hmm. That's actually, you kind of tangentially brought up what I think is a really salient point about archetype driving cards, especially as it pertains to planeswalkers. Not every cube contains planeswalkers, and even still, you can definitely kind of translate to what the best value cards or what the most draftable, most powerful cards in your cube are. When it comes to a high-powered cube, and you have a card and it's for a very specific archetype, that this card's going to be radically different. You are going to try to draft a deck that does this thing. Is this thing more powerful than just putting another planeswalker in your deck? That's actually a really good benchmark. If you want an archetype driving card, it should perform at its ceiling noticeably and commonly better than just the average good card style card.
Yeah, you want to incentivize people to work for it. And you do that by making sure what they work for is worth it.
Exactly. Yeah, so this kind of some good discussion. So we talk about archetype diversity. There is the really macro. My cube has aggro, combo, control. And for a lot of cubes, there's not necessarily going to be combo. Often it will be just aggro and control. It's tough to only have exactly one archetype. I mean, you kind of can say this cube is all aggressive. It's all control. You can maybe say it's all combo, but invariably in matchups, you at least have a feeling kind of just who's the beatdown 101. Somebody is quote unquote the aggressor and quote unquote in the control role. So you can't really actually have fewer than two when you really dive into it. But on the other side of it, you have designing each individual color towards one or more archetypes, each color pair towards one or more archetypes, and then really getting into it with kind of these individual cards or small package archetypes. And there's just so many ways to do it. I know from drafting your classic cube and our discussion on persist combo, you really like these small package archetypes that kind of shines through in your design.
Yeah, I do. I love them a lot, particularly the small packages when they overlap with a few different kinds of archetypes, which we talked about in our episode about persist combo, how, things like metallic mimic as a piece for persist, but also something that let white have this human sub-theme for its aggressive deck. So I do really like small packages. I'm a big fan of what I'd call slot equity, which is, regardless of, your cube is bounded. It's not, whatever the size, 360, 450, 540, if it's a two bird, it's 180. Maybe it's huge. Maybe you have a 720 cube. But, we're defining cubes by numbers here, and that number is the number of cards that you get to put in it, which means that you have a limited number of slots. And so, using those slots to the best of your ability is one of the most fun puzzles, in my opinion, of cube design. And so the concept to me of slot equity, it's not about, I must have exactly one green 5-drop. No, nothing like that. It's that, you want every card to be worth its slot. I talk about this concept often when it's when talking about utility lands. Most utility lands, like there are a ton of utility lands that aren't in anybody's cube. They're probably in plenty of people's cubes, but they're not common in cube, that if I had in my pool in a color that, could use that utility, I would put it in my deck. And I'd put it in my deck almost 100% of the time, even maybe. But the card itself isn't good enough to be worth the slot over another card that I could play. right? Otherwise, I'd end up with like a cube that's all lands or something. What's in it? There's what's an example of this? I think what's it called? Cephalid Coliseum. I love that land. I think that blue land is awesome.
From Odyssey, probably less known than I would like it to be, but yeah, land that taps for blue, it deals a damage to you. Damage to you if you use it for mana. And then if you have Threshold, you can tap it, pay a blue, and sacrifice it to draw 3 cards and discard 3 cards.
It's target player, so it works with Narset.
Okay. Oh, that's dirty. That's filthy.
But I'll say, I think a lot of my blue decks in Cube, especially the combo ones, but a lot of them, and we know I do like my combo decks, would play that card, but I don't have it in my Cube because I think that basically only blue decks can play that card. So it's competing with other cards that only blue decks may play, and there's some steep competition there. So when I'm talking about slot equity with respect to archetypal diversity, I mean, when you are trying to support an archetype, you're going to need to dedicate some number of slots in your cube to supporting that archetype. The reason why we're overlapping this episode to talk about redundancy is that it's very important when supporting different archetypes to have a density of slots that support that archetype in order for it to be reliable and consistent. But one of the reasons why I love these small packages or these little cards that sort of spawn an archetype, things like opposition is a really powerful example of a card like this, that you can sort of throw in. It sort of invents its own new deck that's a perturbation on other things that you could maybe do. But with cards that all already exist there, that costs 1 slot, right? And so that's a really, really good use of that 1 slot to promote archetypal diversity. That was a long-winded answer. I don't even know if there was a question, but.
Oh, yeah. To the extent that there was, I think it was a good answer. And it does kind of get down to a broader point that I really wanted to emphasize on this episode. When you go and read the write-ups of the various Magic Online cubes as they launch those digital cubes, there's typically an emphasis on a color breakdown. Typically, it's 2 color pairs, and it talks about every 2 color pair and the archetype, the broad archetype that this color pair is supporting. And it is good to design 2 color pairs with an idea of what a deck of this color pair looks like. I think that's definitely a very good focus. Certainly when you put a gold card in your cube, you want to purposefully have it there so a certain style of deck actively wants to play this card. That makes a lot of sense. But the point that I want to highlight is archetypal diversity is so much deeper than just there are 10 2-color pairs. Most decks are 2 colors. These are the things you're going to draft. There's monocolor decks, there's breakdowns, 2-color decks can do different things. Even if you have a very specific focus on one archetype, your Boros aggressive deck. There's not a ton else Boros can do, but there's a couple cards that can push you in a different direction, and you can definitely get into 3-color decks. And then a 3-color deck is maybe just taking some of what's going on in any of the 2-color pairs that build up to that 3-color set. And maybe it's a situation where the 3rd color actually pushes it, and now something is possible. It's not necessarily going to be something you can do with any of the individual color or colors without going the full 3. And you can get into 5-color, sometimes 4-color. You can even have gold cards that are 3 or more colors in your cube. Just tons of different ways to iterate on what the different archetypes and decks look like in your cube. And I don't even think that if you go in the other direction, I think it's totally fine if you have more than 1 color pair doing the same thing. A great example of this is, I think that Rakdos and Orzhov, it probably should be common that a cube just has both of these color pairs doing sacrifice. And you just branch into Mardu's sacrifice. And there's different flavors, of course. A Rakdos sacrifice deck tends to slant more aggressive, tends to be Blood Artist effects, Mayhem Devil effects. This is an aggressive style of sacrifice deck, where the Orzhov deck is maybe a little bit grindier, but ultimately they're doing a lot of the same things, and they naturally will synergize very well. And so the diversity in cube archetypes is so much more than just 2 color breakdowns. Like Ryan was saying, there's a lot of individual cards that can really push you into different archetypes. The ways that different color pairs interact. You can even just have more than one color pair doing the same thing, and you get the archetypal diversity in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, it's almost like what's the word or the idea of like, it's like a kind of this, you get to play with the pieces and you put them together from all around, and it sort of creates something new every time. I don't know. I'm not going to be able to necessarily think of it, but with your example of Rakdos and Orzhov, it actually, that specific example presents a really interesting phenomena that I generally observe in cube and limited, but rare and limited because monocolor decks are rare and limited. So something that I see in my cube a lot and other cubes as well, where you can definitely Rakdos Sacrifice exists, it's more aggressive. Orzhov Sacrifice exists, it's less aggressive, and Orzhov Sacrifice in my personal cube ends up being more combo oriented due to access to more persist combo pieces. But what ends up happening is almost the full range of possible macro archetypes that you can support, all the way from, aggro on one end, mid-range in the middle, control on the other end. And I would argue that in order to talk about combo in this way, we now need to remove the idea of this being a linear spectrum to inject combo into there, because it doesn't interact that way.
Right.
But what I'll see is you have 2 overlapping 2-color pairs. The monocolor they overlap on will be the ceiling of the aggressive strategy that conceptual archetype, in this case sacrifice, can support, which is true in my cube. Mono black aggro is very fast and often has a sacrifice subtheme. And then if you go up to the 3 colors, you usually end up on the full other end of it. You end up with a more on the bigger mid-range, playing a more controlling role in more matchups kind of deck. And one of the things that I love about this, and that I think this really communicates, is achieving archetypal diversity in a cube environment. To me, it's about most color pairs, most decks, most things that you can do, being able to construct them in a way that there exists a matchup such that your deck plays any role. There exists a matchup in the cube in which your deck is going to be the aggressor. There exists a matchup in the cube in which your deck is going to be the controlling deck. There exists a matchup in the cube where they're going to be kind of in line, such that you're playing this more mid-range resource war. And this phenomena emerges often with overlapping archetypes because of what I just said, where sort of monocolored ends up being a focused aggro, 3-color ends up being more at the top, and then the normal 2 colors that are shared ends up being more in the middle. But that's still a concept, in this case sacrifice, that can be described by the full breadth of macro archetypes, while also seeing a bunch of different micro flavors in the different color pairs, different cards, and different ways that you can achieve the sort of overall archetypal concept of sacrifice. And that's awesome. And I think that if you think about this, when you're designing archetypes in your cube, you get all of these, I think the best word to describe it is emergent, all of these like really awesome emergent properties that lead to very replayable draft experiences and really compelling gameplay.
You just kind of touched on a lot of different things, and I'm not exactly sure what to jump into, because there's a couple things that I found really interesting there. I love the note about having kind of a monocolor focus with your broader themes. That's going to be the most aggressive way your example was for your sacrifice decks to take. That makes a lot of sense. When you talk about mono black aggro, you get into 1-drops. You have Carrion Feeder just as a great 1-mana sacrifice outlet that hits hard and fast, some cheap sticky creatures in mono black that'll keep coming back in your sacrifice deck. And then I know we were talking about Mardu. I don't have a great example of a Mardu card because they're all horrible, but If you got into Jund for your sacrifice deck, then
Sure.
you get into really powerful gold cards like Corvold Fakehurst King, where you have this card that, yeah, it hits hard and fast, but it also presents sort of overwhelming value. You can immediately draw a bunch of cards with your Corvold. So you're really kind of doing the same macro thing. These are both cards that are great for a sacrifice archetype broadly, but then you have a direction where you can go really pedal to the metal, aggressive, quick, or really grindy playing the late game when you have to play a more controlling role. And I know it's a little out of character for me because it's a Celestia card, but I have talked about this card in depth. I'm going to wax poetic about Kitchen Finks for a minute, because I think that it's a really good example of a sort of card that speaks to another point that you made about how your deck, if you have this archetype that exists in this cube, there's going to be matchups with your aggressor. There's going to be matchups where you're in the control. And then, if you're really getting into it, your classic cube, of course, has a bunch of combos. There's going to be matchups where you really lean on that combo versus taking the other roles as well. But as you said, that's, of course, kind of a sideways thing. But anyway, Kitchen Finks is such a good poster child for a card that is good at being aggressive sometimes and controlling other times. And it's such a good example of a card that you get a lot of mileage out of because of how flexible it is in these roles. You have a 3/2 that persists, gains life. So you just have all these parts of the card where gaining the life, coming back, this creature is really good at blocking. It has 3 power and it comes back. This creature is really good at attacking and fading the first removal spell. And just these cards that just kind of give you enough on rate, and you can conceive of them being flexible in how they have to approach a matchup in a macro sense, really enriches the gameplay of a cube.
Yeah. I mean, I love Kitchen Finks for exactly that reason. And almost it took me a while to actually figure it out. Kitchen Finks is one of those cards. It's actually, as kind of a funny aside, I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before. So I'm quite an aggressive player, and I am not like a big fan of incidental life gain. Not that I don't think it's good. It is. I just don't like life gain. Like I have in retail limited, I have conceded the black-white mirror once I knew it was the black-white mirror way more than I should have, just because I was not about to play it.
Like I am a fan of the occasional tight concession.
But so Kitchen Finks is one of those cards that confuses me, because often I'll say like a heuristic. It's not like a valuable heuristic. This is more for it's I find that I tend to like creatures a lot less with incidental life gain, and I like them a lot less if they have less power than toughness. Like Courser of Krufix is kind of the epitome of good card that kind of makes me groan. Kitchen Finks confuses me in my brain a lot because of that, because it has the incidental life gain, and my brain keeps like wanting to perceive it as a 2/3, but it's a 3/2. But I do like that card a lot. I know that was mostly a confusing aside, but and I like it for, what it provides is like this nice glue that it's not like the glue that holds your deck together. It's almost like the glue that, as you put it, allows you this flexibility of taking the right role that you need to. It's not the best at being the aggressor, but it's quite annoying if you are the aggressor and that is, a 3/2 that's going to trade and still be attacking after it trades. And one of the other things about Kitchen Finks is like one of the better ways to beat somebody who's being the aggressor is to race them. If you can, surprise them and kill them first, and the life gain on Kitchen Finks makes that quite hard to do as well. When you add in, for Kitchen Finks' case, that it also supports a whole other archetype too, right? It supports persist combo. I mean, that's everything.
Yeah, absolutely. A card that is diverse in its ways that it supports diverse archetypes.
Yeah, quite meta.
Really an all-star. So these are kind of a few different ways you can approach seeding archetype diversity in your cube. There's, of course, just the baseline. This is what these color pairs do. There's just the macro archetypes, which you will naturally end up supporting so long as your cube includes Magic the Gathering cards. And then there's a really specific stuff. You have your small package, things like your persist combos, your storm combos, or then specific cards like opposition or like recurring nightmare, where you have this card in your deck. And now I am trying to do this thing every game. This is the powerful end game that I'm playing towards. Or even if it's just a sideways way to implement the opposition, of course, could just also be in a deck with an overrun effect or a Craterhoof Behemoth. And there's kind of these ways you approach the game that's very unique based off of a very small number of cards. Are there any other notes that you would like to hit on archetype diversity before we jump into redundancy?
No, I think we covered quite a lot.
All right, sounds good. So we're going to take another break, then we'll be back to talk about archetype redundancy. What's up, gamers? Taking a break from the pod to talk to you about Star City Games Premium and why, if you're not already a member, you really should become one. First of all, the price is great. Only $7.99 a month. That's less than the price of one collector booster. And for that, you get all the following. You get a 5% discount on all Magic the Gathering sealed product, including the aforementioned collector booster, a 10% discount on all Magic the Gathering singles, if that's more your speed, and as well as a 15% discount on all supplies. It's going to be your deck boxes, your binders, your sleeves. Lord knows I always need more sleeves for cubes and all the Magic cards I have lying around. And you also get free entry into some SCG Tour online events. Definitely check those out. And finally, last but certainly not least, you get exclusive access to Star City Games website content from a stable of some of the game's greatest and most entertaining minds. You know who we are. You know where to find us. Sign up for SCG Premium today at starcitygames.com/join-premium. Welcome back, everybody. We just talked about archetype diversity, which means it's time to talk about archetype redundancy. So what exactly does archetype redundancy mean for Q, Brian?
Redundancy, to me, is all about sort of resilience, expectation, and consistency. So to me, if we're talking about archetypal redundancy, it's that the probability that I can draft that archetype, if it's redundant, should be near one. Not that I can sit down at a draft and force my way into it if the person to my right is also doing the same thing. That's not going to be a good time. But the probability that all the pieces necessary to be able to draft a good deck of that archetype are opened, and that you are able to have the opportunity to pick them should be very high. That probability should be very high if an archetype is redundant.
Got it. Yeah, and there's a couple different ways. If you're talking about a deck that really just needs a lot of the same kind of effect, that's going to be a monocolored aggressive deck. The redundancy is just going to be volume of pretty interchangeable cards. For your mono red aggro deck, Goblin Guide and Monastery Swiftspear, just other 1-mana creatures with power and toughness. That's going to be some redundancy just on volume. I want as many of these as I can get. And then there's other more specific things. You have redundancy for Reanimator, which is going to be making sure you have a lot of discard outlets, ways to get your large creatures into the graveyard. You're going to have different large creatures to get into the graveyard, and then different Reanimator effects. Just kind of making sure that you have enough of any style of card necessary to support a deck to actually make those decks come together and play games of Magic.
Yeah, exactly. Something that I do when I'm purposefully designing some archetype for my cube. I have a 540 card cube, and I most commonly end up drafting it with 8 people, although at least pre-COVID that was true. Pre-COVID, I drafted it with 8 people all the time. And I would basically say, okay, 360 out of 540 is 2/3 of the cube. So if I were to randomly sample 2/3 of the cube, how many reanimation spells am I expected to be in the pool? Let's say in pack 1, they're taken relatively highly. What does that mean for the ability to get them in pack 2 and pack 3? And how does that inform how many I feel like I need to put in my cube if I want there to always be able to be a Reanimator deck at the table. Now, no, I don't mean, and I think this is important to say, I don't mean that there always is a Reanimator deck at the table. And this is one of the things that helps reframe, and I think before we talk about redundancy, it's important to help reframe why diversity and redundancy aren't necessarily polar opposites, right? A deck can be draftable and nobody necessarily drafts it. This can happen with Reanimator. And one of the nice things about certain Reanimator pieces, particularly the ones that can hit both graveyards like Reanimate and Animate Dead, is that you can put them in mid-range or controlling decks, and you can still have, very strong draws where you thought seize your opponent and reanimate what you take, or you kill a good threat of theirs and reanimate it, or you just end up, reanimating your own good 4 or 5 drop for some mana advantage. You're not playing the Entomb, and you're not sort of like playing all of these discard outlets to be able to, go turn 2 Grizzlebrand, but you can still use the pieces. So my point of that is, it's important when thinking about things to make sure that you have enough of them for them such that if anybody wants to draft it, that is an option at basically any time. That's what having enough redundancy for an archetype means. That does not mean there needs to be somebody drafting it at every single table. And I think that's an important distinction.
And some subtext in what you just said. Another thing, even if like you can have people casting Reanimate for value, and then also just having some Reanimator targets that are just reasonable to cast, I think is an awesome way to be redundant in an archetype, because it's not just like having the 5th, 6th Reanimator spell that costs a little bit more mana. It's like, okay, well, I'm looking for a Grizzlebrand, but it's pretty good to reanimate Grave Titan. And it's also pretty reasonable to cast Grave Titan. So just kind of expensive, but not overly expensive threats are kind of an awesome form of redundancy there, which kind of segues into kind of the next broad point I want to break up. Can you think of any examples of extreme redundancy in archetype, on the extreme side of that, of really just having a ton of stuff to make sure an archetype lands, or maybe an example of very low redundancy where it's really tough to make something regularly draftable?
Sure. So for something that's tough to make regularly draftable, any archetype that is, fundamentally based around a card concept in which there just aren't many playable ones, right? Or aren't enough to make it reliable, as I mentioned at the beginning, such that when you sit down, you can expect to be able to draft it. At least at a size greater than 360, let's say. So the example for that would be a Taking Turns deck, right? Even in the powered in a powered 540, let's say. In my cube, I have drafted a Taking Turns deck. My current cube has, I guess it's not powered, but it has I think Time Warp. I think it has 3 Time Walks. It has 2 of the Time Warp kind of cards, and then Nexus of Fate. Okay, but that means that on average, there's going to be 2 on a given table. Other people might take them. And the archetype of just taking turns, doesn't exist without them. Nexus of Fate is the only one that can do it with itself, and then you also need to get high priority cards like Eternal Witness and Regrowth and your Crystal Shards, or your ways of looping the Eternal Witness to be able to really take all of those turns. Basically, if you're not at like a 360 cube, there's almost not enough real estate to support a massively redundant Taking Turns deck as an archetype. That's not to say that you can't have it be something that is draftable in your cube that provides a good experience because it's using cards that are also playable in plenty of different places. You can absolutely have Taking Turns supported in your cube, and that be an awesome thing that comes together every once in a while. I believe that's how it is in my cube, and I actually really enjoy that. But you're not going to achieve redundancy on it, at least not at 540, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a really good example of like a sideways archetype, I believe they're called, where you have all these pieces, like you were saying, Eternal Witness, this is just a good card. Extra turn effects, you can often find a way to leverage that. It's not difficult to convince yourself to play those cards, but you're not going to have a bunch of extra turn effects and a bunch of ways to combo. There's only so many that exist that are really playable, and that play experience, you don't necessarily want to have it every time. So that, and then of course, like the single card archetypes, you can only have an opposition deck if you drafted the card opposition. So you can only be so redundant on these style of decks. I really like the taking turns example. I wouldn't necessarily have thought of that, but just this archetype that is kind of a full combo deck that exists with a bunch of individually playable cards. Otherwise, that's pretty cool. But then what's an example of like an extremely redundant archetype where you'll just see pieces constantly?
Storm. Storm is an archetype that fundamentally cannot exist if you don't, go as far to the, as far as you can to support it, right? One of the reasons I don't support Storm in my cube is because I believe it costs too much in slot equity, right? It requires me to play too many cards over other cards that I want to support other archetypes or whatever in order for this deck to be draftable and good, as well as be an option in quite a few tables, right? If it's it's hard for me to, because basically if you don't make it an option always, then your redundancy is so low that unlike the taking turns example with low redundancy, you just end up with a bunch of last picks that nobody ever uses. Mm-hmm. Whereas in that example, at least these were playable cards. So you have to go super extreme to support Storm. And when you do, it's a fan favorite in the Vintage Cube. Is it one of the best decks? No. Have I trophied with it a lot? Yeah. Have I played it more than I should? Also, yeah.
Same.
But it is redundantly supported and good. And again, when I say good, I don't mean like good in the competitive sense, like you should actively do it if you want to win. I mean good in it is supported enough that I can sit down, look for the pieces, see that they're there, go to try and draft it, and have the opportunity to 3-0.
Yeah, that's definitely a good example of an archetype that requires a lot of slots, a lot of redundancy. You need your rituals, you need your kill conditions, and you generally are going to need, it's a pretty good segue to another point I want to touch on for archetype redundancy, but you're generally going to need a lot of card selection. This can be card advantage draw spells. More commonly, it's going to mean Ponder, Preordain, those cantrips that give you some extra looks. For Storm, for Reanimator, you're often looking for tutors. I know tutors were a big talking point for you when we talked about the deep dive on Persist combo, those green creature tutors being a really big deal for that. So talk to me a little bit about card selection as a tool for archetype redundancy and some do's and don'ts.
Yeah, I mean, card selection is the most important tool. Something that I, when I initially was designing cubes, I really overlooked this. And now you have to pry opt from my cold dead hand. And now consider, and if they print another one, that one too. The thing that I've realized, right, is that tutors and card selection, cantrips, however they exist, especially since we're talking about cube in a singleton setting, right, you try your best to provide redundancy, right? Enough reanimation spells, enough storm wind conditions, enough persist cards, such that a player can draft a deck built around them. But let's say you're talking about a blue-black reanimator deck with, maybe I really want my reanimator decks to have, 3 reanimator spells, so there's a high probability I draw one every game. You know what? Remove one of those reanimator spells and give me 4 blue cantrips. I don't know if the probability is the same. I'm not saying they're the same, But conceptually speaking, that's the frame of thinking, right? A single tutor is, right? Tutor is a more obvious example because you can tutor for, which part of the combo that you need. But there's this glue that, like, the card ponder, the card brainstorm, the card opt, they're almost like a split card of everything that you could support that might be in a blue deck. Because they basically smooth out your draws to be what you need. But when you're talking about redundancy over archetypes, once you have your deck and you're in an archetype, you evaluate your deck as a function of the redundancy that you have to do the thing that you want to do. And your card selection brings up that redundancy every time. And so I think card selection is one of the most important tools to maximize the redundancy that your cube offers without having to add a million duplicates of every single effect you want to support.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that the cantrips can do and the tutors can also do is they can really help facilitate the point that we went over regarding archetype diversity. Once you have just a couple ways to set up your reanimator combo or whatever your deck is, and you have some cantrips instead of just more versions of the same card, these actually really help you in navigating the matchups where you have to take on a different role, because they'll find your combo when you're being let to combo. They'll also find your disruption in the matchup where you maybe have to be more disruptive. Specifically, just kind of continuing with the reanimator example, they'll find your pack rat when you really just need to get going on the battlefield if you're not sure you can set up your combo otherwise. Maybe it's against like a scavenging ooze, so you just kind of have to get going with something else. So these card selection cards, they really help you both execute a specific archetype with only a couple pieces that you want to find regularly, but they also really help with changing roles when that becomes necessary, which is kind of the awesome thing about it. And that'll translate to persist combo and the creature tutors as well. Sometimes you play a matchup where it's like, okay, I have most of my combo. Looks like the combo is going to work. Looks like I can't win otherwise. And sometimes it's just like, I'm going to tutor for Restoration Angel because I don't think my opponent can beat Restoration Angel plus Blade Splicer. So kind of a lot of things going on with that. And they really help you do a lot of things. You do want to be a little bit careful because the more tools you have for card selection, you do kind of crowd out some of the second best and third best options. You'll start to see some cards that when you kind of look at your cube by curve, if you can draft a deck that has the best option at any point in the curve and you have some good card selection, you're just going to see the less good options just show up less often in decks, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You want to monitor it, see how it actually plays out. But the more you bring up the card selection, you will start to see some cards in your cube stop showing up in decks. And you do want to be aware of that.
That's a really, really good point. I think something to really consider about, it's what you want, right? Ultimately, a cube belongs to a person, right? And that person has some idea of the experience they want. I know some people who adore EDH because of the 98th and 99th cards in not just their deck, but everybody's deck. Mm-hmm. These cards that you just never see that somebody chose to put there because they love it. It has some story. It has some theme. It's fun. It's not necessarily good. And I'm sure, competitive EDH decks end up maximizing cantrips, tutors, and those cards don't exist in those decks. But there can be really positive experience surrounding those cards that they're not the best, but they do a role fine. They see play because they do that role fine, and they're fun and there's some memories oriented with them. And it is a true point that fully going on the maximizing tutors and card selection tools is going to make those cards get cut more often. And I know in my personal experience with my cube, as I said at the beginning when I designed cube, I did it this way. I ended up definitely cutting a lot of cards for the phenomenon that you just said, Ryan, that they just stopped seeing play once I completely started maximizing the tutors and the cantrips.
Yeah, so just a good thing to keep in mind. You'll strike the balance as you play more. Of course, your cube, your rules, you'll figure it out. And then I want to talk about one more thing regarding archetype redundancy, at least one more thing. But a concept, this one, it can be kind of grating to me if I draft a cube that has a lot of this. I want to talk about strictly betters and strictly worses. Yeah, this is a term that Magic players talk about a lot and often in hyperbolic terms, but it is just true. Overwhelmingly, the card Reanimate is a better card than the card Necromancy. And you can go down from there. Maybe a much clearer example is the card Reanimate versus the card Zombify, where it's like, I don't think I want to pay 4 mana for that effect if somebody else is getting it for 1. And if you want to make sure an archetype shows up, of course, you want to have these redundant parts. But there is a point where you kind of look at 2 cards in a pack. Like, just think of some version of a card and some version of a card that's just much better on rate. You can probably look at your own cube. I can look at some of my own cubes, for example, of this. Like, that they're there. Don't pretend they're not there. And just like think about the experience of seeing both of these cards in the same pack. And it's just, okay, this is the illusion of choice. I could be a real pedant and talk to you about why my life total matters and why I'm drafting this Zombify, but I'm just being a jackass. That's stupid. Like, Reanimate is the pick every time. Come on. So it does bother me a bit, unless I'm talking about an archetype that really wants a lot of similar things. By and large, obviously the card Counterspell is much weaker than the card Mana Drain. I'm very happy to play both in my vintage cube decks. There is some room for strictly worses, but I do think that this is a good focus point because of that experience I'm describing. It is unfortunate to kind of face down 2 cards that do similar things when the pick is obvious. I think that's kind of a deflating experience.
Right. So you're, I guess what I'm hearing is you're in the, what's it called? Not in the volcanic hammer goes into the cube with lightning bolt camp. Right.
And in fact, as there's been a proliferation, I guess that this was a few years back, but as we got more and more Incinerate, Searing Spear, instead of putting 4 copies of 2 mana deal 2/3 damage at instant speed, I just stopped playing any of them. I've lost interest in that effect entirely.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I like. I actually really like Punishing Fire in my cube. Just like it's not. I mean, it's probably worse in 90+% of red decks because the ones that don't have Grove than any deal 3. But it provides something unique in certain scenarios. If you need it, you need it. It's not a deal 3, and it's actually come up quite a few times playing mono red where. Like the ability to get it back when my opponent is doing the worst thing possible to me, which is gaining life. That like it is a tool to help combat that.
It's the sideboard technology against kitchen finks.
But yeah, I think so personally, it doesn't bother me, actually. It doesn't bother me at all. I understand why it does. And I think there's sort of like room to discern, where your line is, right? I think for the, lightning bolt volcanic hammer, right, is like there's a lot of space in between. You have to really talk about maximizing redundancy of burn to get to volcanic hammer, which if you want to support a literal burn deck, that's a way to do it, right? Like really just say, okay, every single Incinerate is getting in there. And it will be possible to draft a deck that is cast 7 spells, win the game. But I think from my end, I still think to tie back into card selection, those cards, while they are the same, like Opt is going to be worse than Ponder, or maybe a better example, or Opt is worse than Ponder, I'll just leave with that example. I'm still going to include both of those in my queue. Like, and part of it is like while they do a similar thing, and one is, for lack of a better word, strictly worse than the other, what they provide from deck to deck, from draft to draft, is different because it's dependent on the deck they're in.
Definitely.
And I think that's still particularly compelling or exciting. And I guess then when you go to the reanimation spells and they really don't, do you feel like the opt to consider, that's a much better example, bothers you less?
Oh, absolutely. I actually think that opt versus consider or opt versus ponder is very similar to mana drain versus counterspell. The delta between mana drain and counterspell is, of course, much wider, but these cards just so clearly are at a rate that is very acceptable for my deck. This is a card I'm happy to play in both circumstances, and it's pretty easy to justify playing both. Another problem that's kind of subtly hanging out with Reanimate versus Zombify is even if I'm a Reanimator deck, okay, I open up both of these cards, I'm not thinking, I'm taking Reanimate and now I'm going to wheel this Zombify. I'm thinking, Reanimate's in my deck, I don't have to think about Zombify existing because it's pointless. There's no purpose to it because I have a much better version.
I misunderstood where you were going. That makes a lot more sense. This is about going so far pushing redundancy that you're effectively including redundant effects that are just not up to par with the other cards in the environment.
Exactly. And there is a point where it's just, okay, these are all for the deck. I'm the player drafting the deck, and I want to play like half of them because some of them are just markedly worse and just aren't going to make the cut.
Yeah. It is interesting because there are some, I think there are some archetypes where you really do have to go deeper. One of the more interesting ones is actually let's tie into Storm on this, because from my perspective, drafting Storm on Vintage Cube, at least, I never ever want Empty the Warrens in my deck. Like, I want my Storm win con to be either Tendrils or Brain Freeze. Often access to, like, Brain Freeze is the better one, but access to Tendrils can be important because of Eldrazi. But generally speaking, those are really the only two Storm cards in existence that, in my opinion, are actually, I want this in my Storm deck. Yet, especially at the size of a 540 and wanting to support Storm, it's almost necessary to include the empty or more? Or do you actually think that, well, you should still cut the empty if, and maybe you disagree with me on the evaluation of empty, if your Storm deck shouldn't even want it?
I'm really sympathetic to this example. This is a really good example of this because I value Empty the Warrens very similarly. When I play it in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, it's typically a factor of it being a 540 card cube and I missed. Like, these are not the Storm decks that are going to 3-0. The best version of this deck does not play this card. And I think it's actually kind of an exception based on cube size, or the other consideration would be a more extreme nature of a cube. So I think it makes sense to include Empty because it's a 540 card cube trying to support an incredibly narrow and specific archetype that requires all this redundancy. I think at 360, it makes sense to move away from Empty because the best versions of Storm are never going to touch it, and you have more access to the best versions of Storm. But there could be a more extreme specific example, and there is the powered Grixis Two-Bird, or even the Grixis Two-Bird before I added the power to it. Storm was just kind of like one of the archetypes, pretty specific focus in red. Of course, black and blue give you a lot of stuff for Storm. And when it comes to combo mirrors, and especially when there's a lot of discard spells and counter spells hanging out, sometimes you do just jam Empty. Empty the Warrens gets a lot better when all of the decks are trying to combo and or interact with your hand and on the stack. So that does change the valuation of the card. I completely agree that it is much worse than the other Storm cards. I do think it's very good comparison that falls in line with Zombify versus Reanimate. And it is one that I think some cubes can cut and others do have good reason to include.
Cool.
And that also does line up a little bit. One point I want to say, I don't like to beat up on people for their cube design. I don't intend for that to be my tone. Of course, there are some exceptions for anything. But one thing I kind of thought of, there's ways to justify everything. You can have cards that are redundant in weird ways that I don't like, but they'll make sense in your design. An example I thought of is if you are playing a cube with like rare slots, if you seed your cube and it's like, okay, these packs need to be sorted. I have a card that's a quote unquote rare, and then there's uncommon slots. Then having some cards being markedly better than other ones in the rare slots, doing some of that, totally fine, makes sense. I'm just saying for the purposes like general singleton cube, if they put Zombify in the Magic Online Vintage cube, it'd be 15th pick every time.
Right.
Anyway, any other points you would like to bring up on the topic of archetype redundancy before we bring everything together?
No, let's take it home.
All right, let's take one last break, and then we'll be back to marry these two concepts.
Hello there from Dominario's Judgment, a weekly podcast for Star City Games with me, Dom Harvey.
And me, Ari Lex.
Where we bring you the latest, greatest, and downright weirdest things Modern has to offer.
Want to know what to expect for next weekend's events? We've got you covered.
Do you want deep breakdowns of the hot topics and decks in Modern? We've got you covered.
Just want to make sure you don't miss the latest nonsense before your opponents teach you a lesson about it in the queues? Oh yeah, we have definitely got you covered. Find us every week on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Or if you want to head over to StarCityGames.com, we'll be right there alongside all the great content from all your other favorite content producers.
All right, welcome back to our episode on archetype diversity and redundancy, and it's time to talk about these concepts as they relate to one another. So the big question that I think that we're trying to answer this week, and I'll pitch it to you broadly, we can get into specifics, but are archetype diversity and redundancy concepts that are necessarily at odds with one another? Does supporting one detract from the other, or are there great ways to balance and facilitate both?
Yes and yes. Right. In the spirit of the question, the answer is no. The concepts aren't at odds, but they are difficult to support both at the same time, right? Like they naturally pull at each other, and decisions you make towards redundancy will often pull away from the overall diversity of your cube, and decisions you make for diversity will pull away from the overall redundancy of the different archetypes in your cube. But there are absolutely ways to mitigate that pull and achieve like a really nice balance between these two for I think as you put it right before we ended the last section, to sort of marry these concepts in a way that makes for an awesome cube environment.
Yeah, and I actually think that the point that is more salient regarding archetype redundancy is going to really come into play when we talk about archetype diversity and archetype redundancy, having a good diversity of archetypes, different strategies players can employ, while also having redundancy on those archetypes. I think that the note on card selection, we talked about it regarding archetype redundancy, but I do think that's the real thing that kind of ties everything together. You're, of course, going to get some of it from cards that can overlap in multiple archetypes. I'll bring that point back up in just a little bit. But just in terms of cards that are broadly playable, cards that are going to be good at making sure your deck is consistent and also are going to play in a wide variety of archetypes, those card selection cards are going to be some of your most important tools, in my opinion.
100% agree.
And then regarding the point about overlapping archetypes, then it's also good. I guess the example that immediately comes to mind is actually sort of a card selection spells, but just making sure that you have things that kind of work in your multiple archetypes. If you want to support multiple archetypes, just having cards that queue off of multiple things. The example I'm going to pull from, these are two archetypes that I like seeing in cubes. I've used both in conjunction in more than one cube. Having kind of a prowess style deck, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, do X, and then having a delirium style deck, a really nice glue card that I really like for Cube is Mishra's Bauble. And, this one's kind of peeled right from the modern deck list page, but it's an artifact in your graveyard. It triggers prowess. It draws you a card, which is going to synergize with fetch lands, or if any of your other cards that care about these things, let you see the top card of your deck or change the top card of your deck. Just having these cards that kind of naturally play into more than one style of deck, particularly the colorless option there. It's going to go well with my Grimflayer. It's going to go well with my Sprite Dragon. So a lot of decks are going to want that card. In my experience, it's a really good thing to have around. You were talking about Eternal Witness. You were specifically talking about a turns style deck. Of course, any green deck is somewhat interested in Eternal Witness. And combo decks definitely persist combo when you're trying to play a grindy game, making sure you can keep getting your combo pieces back if they go to the graveyard for any reason. Just having these cards that play in a bunch of different archetypes, that's going to be really important as well.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought this up because I think this, taking this a step further demonstrates why these concepts can work next to each other. So intuitively, they're at odds, right? And the reason they're intuitively at odds is generally, right? You can make you have a limited number of slots. We've said this quite a few times on this podcast, this episode. You have a limited number of slots. And, when you're thinking about it, you can dedicate a slot to helping diversity, or you can dedicate a slot to helping redundancy. And there are some things that you can do to, help with both, right? Where we talked about tutors and cantrips, those kinds of things help with both. But when you're talking about a card that supports multiple archetypes, right? When there's a lot of overlap, that's one slot. It's not, supporting an archetype usually takes many slots. So let's say you have a card that exists that supports 4 archetypes, maybe even, that you have in your queue. And you get to put one card that supports 4 archetypes. Okay. That is, because it's 4 archetypes there, that's promoting diversity. Because it's one slot, you have more room in your cube to add more cards like that and end up with a redundant support of a wider number of archetypes. So finding these cards that overlap lets you sort of get more mileage out of each slot in your cube and pull double duty in order to achieve a cube that has archetypal diversity and archetypal redundancy.
And another point that I want to make, a good tool that plays into diversity and redundancy, just cards. I specifically mentioned Mishra's Bauble. That's really diving into supporting 2 specific archetypes, giving you something that 2 decks really want. There's also something to be said to the value of just really good cards on rate for archetype diversity and archetype redundancy. Like they're not necessarily going to be on plan with what you're trying to do. If we just put another 3 mana planeswalker in your cube, or one of the good 4 mana planeswalkers. However, your aggressive deck, your control deck, even your combo deck, you're not going to have a bad time if you just play more good planeswalkers on rate. This is not the exact 1-to-1 correlation with your card selection spells, but it's just another card that on average you're going to be happy to draw. And just kind of making sure that you use some of it's a really good card for slot equity, the concept you were talking about, where just here's a card that a bunch of decks will play. And it's not specifically advancing the position of one archetype or another. Gideon Ally of Zendikar shows up in all of my white aggressive decks and all of my white control decks. Really, all of my white decks are going to play this card. And just kind of having these cards that is another card that's really good when you're playing an aggressive role or a controlling role. So it really kind of ties into a number of things we talked about today, and just having just these really powerful cards that everybody will play just kind of make sure that everybody at the table is happy with their deck. It kind of bolsters the average deck quality.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. I would have completely not mentioned that. I didn't even necessarily think about it, but it's just correct. At the beginning, we were talking about how when I was defining diversity, And I explicitly said, like, I want to condition this on the fact that the decks are good, that you could draft them and that you can, 3-0 when you draft them. That's a plausible outcome. And how that was, important for diversity. And it's important for it in the sense of consistency, right? Like being able to consistently perform and consistently do well, which is how we effectively define redundancy. And like a really common factor between both of those things are going to be powerful, strong, and good cards to function as sort of like a glue. So at the end of the draft, you still end up with a good deck.
Yep, absolutely. You want the decks to be good. At least some of the cards should be good. Synergy can get you some of the way, but power is ultimately going to be important to getting you all the way home. Yeah, for your successful cube decks, at least in the higher powered cubes. And then you did have one more thing you wanted to touch on. I'm not exactly sure the best way to frame it, so I'm just going to let you dive into this one.
Yeah, so I call this seeding archetypes is the word that I've used in the past. It's another sort of one slot or a very small number of slots idea. And it specifically usually functions on macro archetypes, something like generally control. These are cards that you don't need redundancy of these effects. You need one. You need maybe, 2 in the cube, but just like 1 in the deck. And what happens is this gives your deck a new texture. The example I like to use, I'm not saying this is a good one for many cubes or whatever, but it's Approach of the Second Sun. If you throw Approach of the Second Sun into a blue-white control deck, or let me rephrase that. If you throw Approach of the Second Sun into the draft pool of somebody drafting blue-white control at the beginning of pack 2, that's going to fundamentally shift the decisions that they make and lead them to draft not necessarily a better or a worse, but a different kind of blue-white control deck. It has a different way of winning, surrounded by Approach of the Second Sun. And another card that's kind of like Approach in this means is Nexus of Fate. It does a couple of other things. Similar idea of if you draw your deck, you will always win. Less, punch win by itself without other extra work, but you can, work and be a little bit more explosive with Nexus. The point is these are 2 cards, right, that you can add to your cube that give different texture to existing archetypes. And that's something that it doesn't need redundancy because that concept, it's not like Reanimator where you need a bunch of reanimation effects, right? And that keeps things fresh. It means that the blue-white control deck today maybe looks different than the blue-white control deck last week because it has a fundamentally different game plan. And that's exciting. And it's really only doable when you can do it with a very small number, usually 1 card, which is why I call it seeding, because you effectively seed 1 card in your cube sort of for that purpose.
Yeah, and then Approach of the Second Sun also plays a bit into what we were talking about regarding your deck shifting your role in matchups based on what you're playing against. Like Approach of the Second Sun adds to something that I really enjoy about Cube is just your sideboard being relevant and really dynamic and caring about what your opponent's doing. Like Approach of the Second Sun is kind of really frustratingly good if your opponent is attacking you with creatures all the time. Like a really aggressive deck that you can kind of hold off and you gain that life and you can kind of pull the rug out from under them. And then it's your win condition. And then it like kind of sucks against a permission deck. So it's this card where like there's kind of this game where like, okay, is the Approach in their deck this game? I don't know. I'll find out. And that's really fun too.
One other thing, a card that I absolutely adore in my cube is Fae of Wishes. And that's exactly why. I think when you have some smaller number of slots dedicated to cards like this, they can still be conditional, and there ends up being like quite a lot of dynamics in the sideboard. And at least in my particular cube, I have very, very strong aggressive support such that most blue decks are pretty happy to be able to just play a 1/4 flying blocker to help handle the aggressive starts. And you can get some pretty dynamic and engaging gameplay surrounding Fae of Wishes. My favorite that I've ever had, and I went 3-0 with this deck, was Fae of Wishes was the only creature in my deck. My win condition was Nexus of Fate. Okay. And I won the game by casting Fae of Wishes for, what's it called? Oath of Druids. Right? Because if I've drawn the Fae of Wishes, which is the only way I can get the Oath of Druids for my sideboard, then there's no creatures in my deck. When Oath of Druids, when I take my next turn, Oath of Druids mills my whole deck, which means I have infinite turns with Nexus of Fate. And now Fae of Wishes is in the Adventure Zone, or whatever you call it, which is a 1/4 flyer, which can attack for the next 20 turns.
Oh, that rules.
And I didn't even plan it when I had those cards in my queue. It just happened in the draft. Like I've seen the Oath of Druids Nexus of Fate decks before, but I actually got to make my deck way better with the Fae of Wishes, because the thing about the Oath of Druids Nexus of Fate decks, right, is you don't win with the Oath turn 2. You literally can't play Oath until you have like 9 lands.
Right. Yeah, you need those lands still in your deck so you can actually cast the Nexus.
Right. And if I like needed something else from my sideboard, the great thing about Fae of Wishes was like I could always like recast it, discard cards to bring it back to my hand to get Oath after I've like stabilized in a control So
yeah, maybe put like a sweeper in the sideboard and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think this kind of, adding cards like this end up creating some like really cool dynamics around sideboarding, which is cool. And if you have such dynamics, strongly recommend Fae of Wishes. It's one of my favorite cube cards that's been printed in the last few years.
Not to steal your thunder, but you reminded me of a really cool story, and it does relate to this and one other thing we talked about today. So I can't help myself but to tell it. But in one of my many attempts at Storm in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, I ended up, against my will, starting Mastermind's Inquisition in my deck. Which is
what do you mean against your will?
Well, I try not to play that card because 4-mana tutor is so much weaker than 2-mana tutor, and you just don't got time to mess around like that in the overwhelming majority of Vintage Cube games. 4-mana's too strong for that stuff.
Sure.
But 2 black, tutor your deck for a card. You can also tutor your sideboard, which is how it relates to Fae of Wishes.
Right.
So I have this Storm deck, and I don't remember if I had Brain Freeze. I know I had Tendrils, and I'm playing against a blue-black X control deck, and they play Ashiok Nightmare Weaver on turn 3. And I'm like, uh-oh. Like, Ashiok is sometimes brutally good against Storm because the exile, just
the
some
Storm
piece
cards,
of your deck you need to function. It can be all your rituals. It can be your card advantage spells. In my case, it was my win conditions. This Ashiok was plussing. I lost my Tendrils. There was no way in my main deck left to win the game. However, it was very good that Ashiok milled me, because then I was able to cast Mastermind's Inquisition for my Thassa's Oracle in my sideboard. That did not make my deck because Tendrils was my win condition, and I cast that and beat the Ashiok. So that was
amazing.
Really cool.
Yeah. Yep. Mastermind's Acquisition was a card that I like, when I looked at it, I was like, I want to be able to play with this card, but this card is too bad.
Right.
like it does the things, like, at least for me, that's where like the 1/4 blocker is and discard outlet, mind you. Again, with Fae of Wishes, I've certainly had my fair share of put a Reanimator spell in my sideboard and then play Fae of Wishes on, like, this is slow, but play Fae of Wishes, block, discard my reanimation, the thing that I want to reanimate, then turn 4, get my reanimation spell. But the 1/4 blocker makes the 4-mana grossly expensive and inefficient sorcery speed tutor palatable, because at least it can peck away at some planeswalkers and it can keep me alive. If I'm interested in that kind of thing, staying alive is probably something I'm also interested in.
Yeah, blocks the hell out of Jackal Pup.
Oh, yeah.
I'll say that much. And then you see more and more 2-mana 3/1s in white. So that's going to raise the value of the creature as well. But are there any other points, topics, stories, tangents you want to discuss on the matter of archetype diversity and redundancy before we close today?
Yeah, I think the thing that I want to end on, or at least conceptually, is, I don't think we've provided an answer, right? Like, how do you do this? And at least I don't feel, and I think that the reason is that there's not, right? There's not like a follow these 3 steps in this order, and you will have yourself a diverse and redundant cube, or the archetypes in your cube will be diversely supported and have the right redundancy. It's a really fine line, and I think what I'll say is, what I would love people to take from this is, when thinking about the cards you're putting in your cube, be meticulous about the roles that they play, and try and push yourself to understand how your cards can play more than one role, because that's where the gold is. If you can get the largest number of individual cards as possible to do as many things as possible, you end up having only 540 cards, but the permutations of those cards provide so many more different things that you can do with them. And that opens up extra room for you to be able to add those cantrips, those tutors, those extra redundant effects, because you have so many cards pulling double duty. I think something that, I think I sent you my list a while ago, or maybe you made some comment, if I'm remembering correctly, about how you usually you're a 360 guy, right? And part of that has to do with when you get to bigger sizes, it almost always feels like there's stuff to shave, right? And that it felt like every card, all the way down to the 540th card, was chosen and purposefully there and there for a reason. And what I'd love to be able to project from this episode is to say that I think thinking about archetypal diversity and redundancy and what we've talked about in this episode leads you to be able to make decisions about cube design in a way that every single card, every single slot really does matter and comes together to create a really cohesive and compelling story.
Some really great notes. To the extent that we did ask an answerable question or started a solvable conversation, I think that's a very good answer. All right, so that's going to do it for this week's episode of the 540. I am Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. You can find my articles about many things Cube every week on StarCityGames.com. I got kind of a spicy one this week. You'll have to go to the website to find out. StarCityGames.com. Ryan Saxe, where can we find you?
All right. Y'all can find me. I'm going to get it right this time at RC Saxe on Twitter. And I also write for StarCityGames.com about the most recent limited format. Although the next few weeks, you probably won't find those articles, as sort of Crimson Vow is coming to more of a close, and my day job is getting very, very busy. But they'll be coming back shortly for sure. Fair
enough. Yeah, there's always new sets coming out. So we look forward to your insights every time. And if you like what you heard today, you can subscribe to the 540 on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Stitcher, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate that. Leave us a review, feed the algorithm, comment on YouTube. Tell me what you had for lunch. Just keep the beast going, and we'll see you next week.